What is your name?
Anthony King.
And where are you from, Mr. King?
I am from Rochester, New York.
And were you aware that the Charlotte Beach in Rochester, New York was one of the last stops under Underground Railroad?
Yes, I was.
What does the Underground Railroad mean to you?
Well, it represents a lot of things. Obviously, it represents freedom most importantly. But the other things that go into making that successful was leadership, unity, coordination. There was a lot of risk involved with people trying to escape slavery. So it took a lot, I think, of effort on behalf of those leaders to really get people safely from slavery to freedom in the North.
And do you think slavery still exists today?
Yes, I do think slavery exists. The 13th Amendment, it does abolish slavery, but the wording used there is no one can be enslaved or an involuntary servant except they be convicted of a crime. So we know now that people can be convicted of certain crimes, they go to prison, and in those prisons they work, sometimes for pennies on the dollar, if anything at all. Especially with privatized prisons now, they create merchandise for private entities, and companies benefit from it, but the prisoners do not.
And does the Underground Railroad still exist in America today? Is there still a secret passageway to reach freedom and equality for African Americans in today's society?
Yeah, well, obviously not necessarily in the physical sense. I think today it's more about learning how to navigate through America, through your career, corporate America, anything you do. You can be an athlete. There's always what appears to be certain barriers for people of color. We always seem to have to do more than other people, and there always seems to be some unwritten code that we don't know about. And some people just don't know how to navigate around it. So, I don't think there's anything, necessarily secret you have to do to get freedom. There's certainly hurdles that other people don't experience for us to achieve the same level of success here.
So it's safe to say that education is the key?
I would say so.
What mistakes have been made by African Americans over the course of our constant fight for freedom and equality?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge has been, especially after 400 years of various forms of oppression, so going from slavery to Jim Crow era to civil rights, all types of other things, the digital divide. We see that, I forgot your question. Can you edit that?
What mistakes have been made by African Americans over the course of our constant fight for freedom and equality?
Yeah, so I think one of the mistakes we made during some earlier times, we found that, black people, we really had to depend on one another. We had to be self-sufficient, and we had to really demonstrate or participate in cooperative economics. We couldn't get the opportunities, from the mainstream America, so we had to stick together. We had to work together, and in many cases, we had our own businesses and things like that. So I think one of the major mistakes we made was integration, trying so hard to be incorporated into America, which, by merit, it's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, I think we had greater successes as a people when we were more independent and reliant upon each other. So I think that's one of the major things. We lost that unity and that connectivity.
Sometime in the late 1800s, Frederick Douglass was living in England because he was a wanted fugitive at the time in the United States. He lived a lavish and comfortable life in London, but decided to come back to America in 1847. Why do you think he came back?
Well, I don't know that his intentions were to live permanently there. I know while he was there, he was, I think it was 19 months, he was lecturing not only in England but also in Ireland. And I think once he got to the point where he could, purchase his freedom, obviously I think he wanted to come back home with his fight because although he was speaking out against it and he seemed to garner a lot of support while he was doing that, I still think he wanted to be back here in the thick of the battle where he could be more effective to see us through all the way to freedom.
So basically, he knew that African Americans needed that unity
Absolutely.
and to stick together in order for us to thrive on
Absolutely.
American soil.
Absolutely.
Do you recognize any modern day injustices that stem from slavery?
Yeah. You know, slavery had a lot of ramifications on us. You know, first of all, financially, there are corporations that benefited from slavery. This country in general benefited from it. You know, anyone with 300 to 400 years of free labor, you know, that's a strong financial ramification there. Obviously, we didn't see any of that given back to us. Many of the promises that were made, such as 40 acres and a mule, and you know, some people got it and lost it, but most people did not. You know, I don't think for the most part, many people of color here in America were given the tools to start life off on the right foot. So we kind of have suffered generationally, financially because of that. Some people obviously have overcome that and moved forward, but as a whole, as a group of people, I think we still see the financial impact in the black community as far as how slavery impacted us. Another thing that, you know, I look at is the relationship between black community and police. You know, originally, you know, back in slavery times, you know, there may have been a sheriff or something like that, but for the most part, the slave catchers were the ones who ended up being police officers. So once there was, you know, Emancipation Proclamation and no more slavery, you know, there was no need to have slave catchers. So a good majority of those individuals became police officers. And I think that's where the origin of that bad relationship between police and black people originated. So obviously we still see that today with police brutality, with police killing African American men, women, and children. So that's, you know, that's just two things I could think of where, you know, today we still see the impacts of that financially, and then also, you know, relationship with law enforcement.
How is the relationship between white people and black people now versus during slavery?
I don't think it's much different, to be honest. The only difference is, I mean, I think those individuals who actively participate in racism, you know, obviously they realize that they don't walk around as lynch mobs and just, you know, outwardly hang people all the time. But we see a general attitude and climate in America right now where, you know, we've always been looked at as less than, and it's been ingrained in the people, you know, that's for some reason that we are superior, and they really don't want to see that equality. So we see it every day when people call the police on little kids for selling lemonade or water, you know, for people barbecuing in the park, for people standing around a stoop waiting for an Uber. All of these things point to the fact that there is some level of discomfort, whether it is conscious or unconscious, when black people exercise our right as a human being just to be and to participate in life and have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We see every day that people do not want us to have that. They look at us differently. They interact with us differently. We certainly don't get the benefit of doubt as others do. You know, so for the most part with us, you know, there's still a strong climate of, you know, outward and, you know, subliminal racism.
Okay. So with so much violence and police brutality on top of the black on black crime, do you think it is too late for African American communities to make a change for the better and unite?
No, I don't think it's ever too late. You know, as I mentioned earlier, you know, coming out of 400 years of oppression, and if we look from, you know, civil rights, you know, let's say 1965 up till now, you know, that's, you know, almost, you know, maybe a little more than 50 years. So it really hasn't been a long time since we've come out of, you know, some of the darker phases of racism in America. So it takes time. There has to be a lot of reconditioning, a lot of education. Um, and again, it comes back to unity. I think there's three things that we need. Obviously we need economic cooperation, supporting our own businesses, building our own businesses, banks, things like that. Things where we can kind of control how we're treated and what we're given from that standpoint, things that are needed to get ahead in life, purchasing homes and things like that. We also need a strong legal base. I think that one of the reasons we see so much brutality from police and no ramifications because there's no consequences for harming or killing a black person. You know, for the most part, all we're going to do is rally and have marches. But after a few days, a few weeks, it kind of dies down and nothing ever happens. So if you look at some other communities, even take for example the Jewish community. They have a strong legal base, so that if there is something that is wrong happening to them or a member of their community, then they're able to put something in place to more so help a person understand that you can't do this to our people. It's not going to be and maybe not an outward boycott, but they will know amongst themselves that we won't support this business. If they're anti-Semitic, we don't support them, and they make noise about it. It's in the media, so they have a strong legal base to ensure things like that don't happen in their community. And then just overall unity. We have to redevelop that love for each other and understand that we are we're enough and we're worthy of living life. We are born with inherent dignity, just like everyone else, and we get to live a good life. We get that just for being born. We don't have to work for that. We don't have to earn it. We get it.
Okay, so what advice would you have for any African American who is uneducated today?
I would say educate yourself. And not necessarily, I'm not talking necessarily school. School education is important. Obviously, if you want to pursue a career, you're going to need higher education. But I think the more important thing is to educate yourself on who you are, your history of yourself. I think that probably would solve about 99% of our issues. I think if young people knew who they were, I think they would conduct themselves accordingly. I think if they knew that they had a really rich history, and not just the good stuff, even the bad stuff, and understand, that people were lynched and hanged and burned and beaten, raped. All these things happened to your ancestors, and people paid the price so that we could begin to move towards a better quality of life. And I think it's very disrespectful to their legacy to really conduct themselves the way that they do, as far as a lot of the things we see, senseless beatings, killing each other, all those things. So yeah, education, school-wise and personal education, knowledge of self is very important.
What is your name?
Anthony King.
Where are you from, Mr. King?
I'm from Rochester, New York.
Were you aware that the Charlotte Beach in Rochester, New York was one of the last stops on the Underground Railroad?
Yes, I was.
What does the Underground Railroad mean to you?
Well, it represents several things to me. Obviously, the most important being freedom. But when we look at how intricate it was, to move groups of people out of slavery from one place to the other, it took a lot of coordination and unity, leadership, just a lot of detail involved to ensure that people were moved safely from the south to the north.
Do you think slavery still exists today?
Yes, I do. We can see it in the 13th Amendment, the document that actually eradicated slavery, but there is wording in there that says, there should be no slavery or involuntary servitude except convicted of a crime. So with that, now we know that people who have been convicted of certain crimes in the prison systems, especially in private prisons. You know, they work for pennies on the dollar, if that, creating products for private companies. So in essence, you know, that is a continued form of slavery.
And does the Underground Railroad still exist in America today? Is there still a secret passageway to reach freedom and equality for African Americans in today's society?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's a secret passageway per se. I would say that you know, we're all aware that there are certain hurdles that we have to overcome in order to achieve the same level of success as some of our counterparts from other races. So, you know, in that sense, you know, I don't know that there's a system that, you know, we necessarily have to go through or something to that effect, but, you know, certainly there appears to be more that we have to do in order to achieve the same levels of respect or success.
Do you recognize any modern injustices that stem from slavery?
Yeah, I would say the major injustice would be just the financial dynamics of that. Obviously, there are a lot of corporations here in America that benefited from slavery. You know, anytime you have 400 years of free labor, you have people who benefited from it, and obviously you have people that suffer as a result of it. So I don't see that we as African Americans have ever been compensated for that travesty, but yet we see banks, other corporations who amass wealth behind that. So when we look at our current condition, you know, we could see that, you know, there's some financial lack there. That's probably the biggest ramification of slavery. But then we have other issues, you know, such as police brutality. You know, most people don't think about the fact that slave catchers, once slavery ended, those people end up being law enforcement officers. So that's always caused a strained relationship between the black community and police departments. Obviously, we still see police brutality. We see increased police killings, things of that nature. So there's always been that strained relationship, but that goes back as far as slavery as well. And then just, you know, unity-wise, you know, we've lost a lot socially as far as how we interact with each other. So I think there's a lot of modern-day issues that stem from slavery. Those are probably the top couple or the top few I can think of.
And how is the relationship between black people and white people now versus during slavery?
Well, I think it's, I don't know that much has changed. You know, now obviously some of the more brutal aspects of it, we don't see. You know, obviously we don't see lynch mobs in the sense of, you know, just a group of people walking around killing black people for no reason. You know, we certainly do have racially motivated killings, but not to the degree we've seen in times past. But I think the overall attitude of white people towards black people, I don't think that's changed much. And we see it now, you know, every day where people just regard us differently. You know, the attitudes, you know, people calling the cops on children for selling lemonade, people calling the cops on families barbecuing in the park, people calling the cops because someone's in Starbucks or waiting in front of their apartment for an Uber. So the prevailing mindset, I think, in America is we still don't get that benefit of the doubt of being born with inherent dignity, where we can live our lives freely and with liberty and the pursuit of happiness like everyone else.
And without being told to go back to where we came from.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because most of us was born here, so this would be where we came from.
Sometime in the late 1800s, Frederick Douglass was living in England because he was a wanted fugitive at the time in the United States. He lived a lavish and comfortable life in London, but decided to come back to America in 1847. Why do you think he came back?
You know, I think his intentions were always to come back. After, you know, lecturing in England and in Ireland, I I believe it was, for 19 months. He was able to purchase his freedom, and I think he wanted to come back to finish the fight. He had still been lecturing about what was happening in America and really driving the abolitionist movement. And I think, once he was able to come back as a free man, I think he had already been set in his heart to come back and have a direct impact on seeing that slavery was abolished.
And with so much violence and police brutality and black on black crime, do you think it's too late for African American communities to make a change for the better and unite? Which is what Frederick Douglass wanted to do. He knew that we needed that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I don't feel it's ever too late. It gets, it's tough to deal with when we see the things that happen on a day-to-day basis. However, after 400 years of oppression, from slavery to Jim Crow era to civil rights, we've really only been out of civil rights, maybe a little over 50 years, if that. So it really hasn't been a long time since we've moved out of some of the darker phases of history in America. So I think it will take time, but I think some of the keys there for us to really, really move beyond that is definitely establishing a strong cooperative economic base, a strong legal base, and as well just self-education. People need to know what we've been through and how we got to this point, what sacrifices were made, and obviously that I think will help us to not repeat some of the mistakes we've made.
What do you think needs to happen in order for black people to unite and live peacefully amongst each other?
Yep, I believe that the key, the cornerstone would be our financial base, cooperative economics. I think one of the things we got away from when we were back when we could not be treated equally, and we were kind of forced to be segregated. And I think we had so much success in that, even though that wasn't the ideal situation that we wanted, yet we still found much success in a lot of black-owned businesses. We were dependent on each other, we were unified, and I think our desire to be integrated, because I think we felt equal meant integrate, but I think we lost something there from a unity standpoint, from a financial stability standpoint, by desegregating.
And what advice would you have for any uneducated African American today?
I would say get educated. Definitely school is important, college is important, especially if you want to pursue a career, or if you want to pursue a trade. I mean, you need some level of education to be successful in life, but not just the schooling aspect of it, but also the knowledge of self part of it. I think people need to know who we are and what we've been through, and even beyond slavery, just going back to find out, how rich our culture really is, and what we